Welcome to the first episode of Tuesday Night Talks here at the Audain Art Museum in Whistler, British Columbia. We're sitting here by the flashlight's glow in a time of closure and doubt. And we're so excited. Over 400 people have registered for this new effort at engagement in a virtual fashion here at the museum. And we're going to use this to bring our collection to light. And tonight, we'll examine the work behind me. And it is Who Will I Become by Ian Wallace. And it comes to the museum courtesy of Michael Audain and Yoshiko Karasawa. It is indicative of what has come to be known as the Vancouver School of Conceptual Art that is over 50 years old now. And a major player who remains part of this vigorous effort out of Vancouver is Ian Wallace. And he joins us live from his studio just near False Creek in Vancouver. Welcome, Ian. How are you this evening?
Well, fine. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you for the introduction. And good evening, everybody. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about a favorite work of mine. Unfortunately, it's my first experience in talking to a computer or doing a lecture to a computer. Normally, I have an audience in front of me, so I've just got to it's a little bit of getting used to it. This work in the Audain collection is a work from the Masculine Feminine series, which is, I started in 1997, and I'll go back over some of that history later, but it's called Who Will I Become? And the title of the work is based upon the caption in the top part of the photograph that you see behind Curtis there, where the caption, which is English translation. Well, actually, it's my original caption of Who Do I Become? And I'm going to discuss what I see and what my intentions are in this work. Now, as a disclaimer, in effect, I just want to indicate that as an artist talking about his own work and explaining his own work, I want you to realize that this is not the beginning and ending of any interpretation of the work. The work is quite open in its interpretation, sometimes a little bit even obscure for some people, but I like to leave the work a little bit open and the interpretation open to anybody's reading of the work where they bring their own experiences and their own interests to the imagery. This particular work, Who I Become, is quite a large work, and it's part of a series of large works of this size, which is 8 feet by approximately 6 feet. The theme, as I said, of this work is taken from a film by Jean-Luc Godard from 1966 titled Masculine Feminine. And it's a part of the Masculine Feminine series. I'll describe some of my intentions and my interests of how I see this series functioning in the formal and technical aspects of my work, as well as in the intellectual and thematic aspects of the work. I must say this work is a favorite work of mine, and in reviewing the work for this particular talk, I've come even closer to it and realized that when I first saw the film that this work is based upon, I was of the same age as the protagonists or the actors in the film. Jean-Pierre Léaud plays the character called Paul, and Chantal Goya, who plays the part of Madeline in the film. It's a film that by Jean-Luc Godard, in which he was exploring youth and pop culture in France from his particular political and aesthetic and existential philosophy that informed the film. Now, at the time when I first saw it, which I believe was at the Odeon Theater up on West 10th Avenue in Vancouver, which at that time was that theater, which doesn't exist anymore, did feature a lot of very avant-garde films. I was familiar with Godard and his filmmaking because I used to follow the Cinema 16 program at UBC, even when I was in high school in the late 50s, when I saw Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, when it first was shown at the Cinema 16 series at UBC in 1960. The film was from 1959, but it was shown in 1960 in a 16mm version in the program run by a local filmmaker called Larry Kent, who also did a film inspired by Godard's kind of low-budget filmmaking of the time, the French New Wave film, a film called Bitter Ash. In any case, so this particular work and this film and this series is quite close to me and close to my experiences and my fascinations and excitement of my own younger period as a student at UBC at this time in the 1960s. Can I have the next slide, please? Just as an interest, here's a vintage poster that's in my poster collection, quite a large poster. It's actually on the wall behind me in my studio. Poster for Masculine Feminine, Sex and Youth in France Today. Of course, as a young student in Vancouver, this would be a very engaging and fascinating and lucrative theme for me to draw me into the subject and identify with the characters. Could I have the next slide then, please? Thank you. Here's, you see, Who Will I Become is the central picture in this installation. This particular iteration of the Masculine Feminine series is from 2010. As I said, I started the series much earlier in 1997 for a show in the Morrison Bina Ellen Gallery at Concordia University in Montreal. Now, the Masculine Feminine series is a general title that I give to a variety of works that explores themes of conflict and difference between male and female. And this, of course, was the themes that ran through a lot of Godard's films of the time. Although this title derives from the Godard film and was used, it was first used in my work specifically in 1997. And the theme of gender conflict first appeared earlier, though, in a series of photo narrative works in the early 70s, in a period that I generally describe as being my early photo conceptual period. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Here's an example of this, of the theme of a masculine feminine theme from a work from 1974 titled Summer Script. This is only half of the series. And this time I was doing these large 4 by 6 foot photographic panels arranged in a kind of a cinematographic sequence on the wall. The whole film, the whole work is a total of 70 feet long with the 2 parts to it. We're only looking at half of it. It was based upon, this particular work was, these images were based upon the work in progress of a film that Rodney Graham and Jeff Wall and I worked on in 1973. And in it, we see the script book that we worked with and images that we worked from video images and photographic images to construct the script in the work in progress. And this work is in fact a documentation of the making of a film that in fact was never finished and never made. So this is the only iteration of this work that I call the Summer Script, which is on the theme of marriage, which is of course the relation of masculine to feminine. Can I have the next slide, please? In 1975, I did another work of the same dimension, very, very large work. We're only looking at one panel from the series of 12 panels of a photographic series called An Attack on Literature. I was trying to write a film script and trying to write a script and it just wasn't happening. So basically this whole work is about blank pages flying through the air, the pages of a script that couldn't be made, but I made it in visual terms instead of in literary terms. But again, the imagery, again, really resonates with the theme of the masculine feminine. But in the process of creating this number of these panoramic narrative sequences, I was attracted to the discourse of feminism, of course, that had become a central point of discussion in critical studies about cinema and contemporary art. And at the time, I was an instructor in art history, both at UBC and then later at the Vancouver School of Art. And of course, in my researches in film and photographic and media history and art history, I was really interested in the themes of and the critiques of film imagery that was appearing in the film literature that drew from the discourse of feminism of the period. And so this theme is something that's been a part of my work for quite a long time. Could I have the next image, please? Thank you. Those works, as I see, were a turn away from my earlier abstract paintings, which you see in this photograph from an installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery in my show from 2012, excuse me. I was doing these purely monochrome paintings in the 60s. And then in the 70s, I turned to this, what I call photoconceptualism. And then now in the 80s, I shifted again to bringing the monochrome painting into a kind of a synthesis with photographic imagery, as it's been the basic trope of my work ever since. We see the Who Will I Become is on the left-hand side, as you see in the installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery here in 2012. In this second period, these works involved a lamination of photographic imagery onto a painted canvas field. And this is the technique that's used for the work under discussion, Who Will I Become? Thus, I was able to blend the discourses of photography with its ability to introduce subject matter and references to narrative themes, the discourse of abstract painting and its relation to the history of modernity and the critique of representation. I thought of this photographic imagery as being a figure inscribed across the field of canvas. Now, the kinds of opposition here, as I'll discuss again as I move into my discussion, between painting and photography, in this particular series of masculine and feminine, we're implying often opposition and a separation of male and female. I see it as a counterpoint to the opposition between painting and photography. The Masculine and Feminine series, which was initiated in 1997, inspired some unique and aesthetic technical features in its composition that was featured in many works throughout the 80s and 90s and up to through the present. Some example of my dialectical approach, which is this, what fancy term I use to describe this theme of opposition. Examples of this dialectical approach to gendered imagery even included a series of large street works titled At the Crosswalk, in which, could I have the next image, please? And here we see an example of At the Crosswalk 5 from 2007, in which a man and a woman are photographed facing each other across an intersection. I've done 9 examples of this particular work, quite a large work, 8 feet by 16 feet, composed of 4 panels, each 4 by 8 feet, 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide. The 2 central panels are kind of a contrasting monochrome color. And so again, the contrast to the spatial contrast, the gendered contrast between male and female are paralleled by a spatial contrast and a chromatic contrast that exists in these, the abstract sections of the center. Could I have the next work, please? This work was exhibited in New York City in 2017. And just by a wonderful coincidence, we see on the left-hand side, the new wave filmmaker, very important avant-garde filmmaker, Agnes Varda, was present at the show with the curator on the right-hand side, Olivier Renel Clément, and they're kind of playing with my imagery. I think this is really fantastic. Agnes Varda died last year at the age of 92. She was a tremendous force and an inspiration for feminist filmmakers throughout the whole period of the 60s, 70s, 80s, to the present, I'd say. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. In 1997, Cindy Richmond, who was then working as a freelance curator, organized a solo exhibition of my work at the Morris and Bina Ellen Gallery in Concordia University in Montreal. I had been impressed by the excellent work by women artists in Montreal at the time, such as Geneviève Cadieux, Angela Grauerholtz, Nicole Jolicoeur, Barbara Steinman, and many others, who were sometimes talked about as a feminine contrast to the group of Vancouver artists, mostly male, who I was identified with. I saw an opportunity to speak about these differences, and the title of the Godard film, Masculine and Feminine, was evoked. But in turning to the theme of gender conflict, I wanted to avoid the overt literary and allegorical approaches of the earlier works, and wanted the symbolic meaning of the work to emerge more from a direct operative handling of the imagery as material. So to this end, I resorted to a very loose, intuitive, and spontaneous collage experiment in which I did numerous, quite small collages that appropriated images from magazine advertisements, film history books, and such, and cut them in half so that the male and female figures were severed from each other and recomposed onto a separated diptych structure. This was my first iteration of the Masculine and Feminine series. Enlarged inkjet prints of some of these original collage studies are on permanent display in the mezzanine of the lobby of the Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel in Vancouver. Can I have the next slide, please? Here we see an example at the Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel in Vancouver of the installation of these collages. Now, these original collages were quite small, only like 8 by 10 inches or even smaller. And what I do is I scan these collages and made enlarged inkjet studies. These inkjet studies then really accentuated the physical and material aspect of the canvas paper I was working with, and the drawing and the painted surfaces that I was using to map out a kind of a relation between the monochrome painting and the cut photographs that were collaged on top of it. Could I have the next slide, please? Here's another example from this same series of collages that were blown up as enlarged inkjet studies. You see my rough painting of the monochrome underground to the photographs that were cut in half. Here's an example of the Masculine and Feminine photograph. This is a scene from Masculine and Feminine by Godard. And the picture at the bottom half, and you just see on the right-hand side of that, just the corner of the face of Jean-Pierre Léaud, who's coming on to Madeline, and the woman in the upper half picture, to get her attention. He was in love with her and was trying to get her attention and make her fall in love with him. Originally, that lower half of the picture was joined up with the upper half. And what I did was cut the picture. And this cutting of the picture had a kind of for me, a kind of a cathartic effect of accentuating this theme of separation and contrast and conflict between the sexes. It also, this cutting of the picture and separation of the imagery also kind of created the severance, kind of symbolically created a slash between the two parts of an image by cutting it in half, and paralleled what I call the solidus, or the slash line that exists between the title of this series, Masculine and Feminine. But this purposefully rough and unfinished collage style that I used for this work provides an expressive effect of dissension that underlies these works. This act of division was a performative symbolism of the separation of the sexes, suggested by the concept of cleavage, coupure, or cutting in French, in the writings of the French philosopher Julia Kristeva. The obvious severing of the image into two parts by version of an aesthetic operation of the image offered an allegorical sign for me of critical deconstruction that evoked a poetics of fragmentation essential to the process of collage, which is the integration of heterogeneous fragments into a unified composition. This poetics of fragmentation opens up potential readings of the work that introduces what I call a conflicted subjectivity in terms of gendered identity, and thus underlies the whole, what I see as perhaps naively from some points of view, and I certainly don't claim to be a sophisticated philosopher of a feminist critique. I'm playing with it as an artist and hoping to eke out of playing with these materials and playing with this theme and playing with these elements some thoughts about this theme. Can I have the next slide, please? Again, we're moving back to our key work of the evening, Who Will I Become? Which, again, to remind you, is the later iteration of this work from 2010 that was done for the, exhibited for an exhibition curated by Timothy Long at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina in the fall of 2010. But it follows quite directly from these earlier collages and is typical in size and format of the earlier canvases of the 1997 Masculine Feminine series. I've composed the two photographs of this series, though, in a related yet distinct staggered arrangement that emphasizes the synapse or the charged space between these photographs. Now, in this case, it's not a severed photograph. It is a capture from a DVD version of the Masculine and Feminine film by Jean-Luc Godard that is actually a shot reverse shot rather than a severed single frame shot. In this more recent shot images, I introduced captions to broaden and expand the layers of interpretation that can be applied to these images. These captions were texts that I introduced on my own, they add a layer of interpretation that expands, you might call what I think of as the existential theme that exists, questions of identity and insecurity about identity, what I call the conflicted subjectivity that exists in most of Godard's work, and it actually is a subtext to the whole theme of masculine and feminine. Can I have the next slide, please? The bottom part of the imagery, again, is the image of Madeline, who's played by Chantal Goya, who actually was a rising music pop star at the time in what was a French pop version of pop music called yeye music. And there's a scene actually in the film of her making a recording as a singer. Godard was fascinated by her. He saw her on television and engaged her to play the role of Madeline in this particular film. So there's a very, very complex in this film relationship between the characters in the film and the characters that they're playing as young people. Madeline was the same age as, she was 23 years old at the time the film was shot. And can I have the next slide, please? The top image from this work, Who Will I Become, presents the title of the work, and it's Jean-Pierre Léaud, who's kind of writing poetry in the cafe, and I think it's poetry. And this title, Who Will I Become, to me, instead, well, normally the role playing that one does would describe it as what will I become? Instead, he's thinking, who will I become? So it kind of has more of an existential dimension back to what I see of as a question of his insecurity. And in this film, and in a number of Godard's films, it's the male characters that's the insecure character, and the female character that's the character that's much more secure and in her identity and what she wants out of life. But the complexity inherent in the structure, insofar, there's a greater complexity in the structure here if one is to assume that the title, who will I become is identified with the male is that in a shot, reverse shot, the subtext, the captions, which of course describe a spoken element in the film, could equally come from the woman who's in the other shot and off screen in effect. So the dialogue in this subtitle need not be spoken by the figure in the frame. This question could equally have been posed by the woman in the frame below, rather than by the man who's in the image in the caption. Thus, the gendered subject of the question is not a certainty, although it is certainly existentialism insofar as it is an open and indeterminate question about a future identity and further intimations of conflicted subjectivity. By this simple strategy, I introduce thoughts of destiny and identity, transformation and temporality, key elements of existential philosophy, or rather a philosophy of existence, as I think of it, that underlies these themes. And of course, as a wannabe beatnik and philosopher in my own teens at the time that this film was shot, all of these themes, of course, resonated in my own experiences. Can I have the next slide, please? I've done more recently more complex versions of these themes of the masculine and feminine series that I carried on. This series that I did in 2007 is titled Event Structure, but uses the same themes of masculine and feminine that appears in the later films. This particular picture that you see on in my studio is actually right behind me as I sit and talk in my studio. But instead of using appropriate imagery taken from existing films, as I did in the masculine and feminine film by Jean-Luc Godard, I hired a male and female model from an agency and directed them to perform actions of attraction and rejection while I photographed them with a still camera. I then made a series of large works that composed on canvas and a complex montage of these dramatic photographs that were then laminated on canvas and accompanied by arrangement of abstract painted segments that evoke an almost cubist compositional dynamic. These works are in fact collages that gather within the pictorial field of the canvas a variety of references and techniques. But the dialectics of this series functions on two levels. Within the theme of the spatial difference between male and female in the imagery, and the divide between the referential aspect of photography and the non-referential field of abstract or monochrome painting. Could I have the next slide, please? We'll return back to who I become. My kind of open question about this, about how to proceed with this theme, might be as follows. This parallel structure of conflict between male and female and photography and painting, or photography and abstract painting or monochrome painting, this parallel structure leads to a further consideration. Is the theme of gender conflict in human relations is purely formal as the difference between photography and painting? And is the structure of conflict and difference necessary to activate the relations between these compositional elements, and by extension, between men and women? I use the phrase contradiction and suspension to describe this recurring aspect of my work. It runs throughout my work. It is a philosophical problem played out aesthetically within the framework of a pictorial work of art, and primarily that of painting, photography, video, and cinema. It is the primary function of a work of art to act as a cipher for such content, to give form to its concept, and not necessarily as a transparent and final answer to the concept, but to engage our understanding through the fascination of aesthetic form. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm just going to finish off here with an image of who I become as a work in progress in my studio during the process of painting the work. In this work, you see that I've painted the underground of white. On it, I've laminated the photographs that are now covered up with masking paper to keep the white paint and the colored red paint from getting on the photographs. of course, to identify where that photograph is, and then the whole series of works, I've pasted images of that particular photograph. I just show this to show that in the process of what might appear in retrospect, and to myself as well, work that is quite intellectually driven, that in fact this work is quite materially driven, and that my intellectual thoughts and the themes and the rumination, the philosophical dimension that I think could be interpreted through the work that I call a literature of images in effect, that I've used time and again, is actually, you know, something that erupts from the actual process of painting. It's the physical process of painting that engages me and provides the ground, in effect, for what might seem to be abstract thoughts or more intricate kind of intellectual thoughts or conceptual thoughts that comes out of my background as a conceptual artist or photoconceptualist, I suppose. So I welcome any questions that you might have. That's the end of my talk. I think it's certainly not the end of what can be said about this work, but it's the end of my talk as I've outlined it for us this evening. And I welcome any questions that you might have to offer.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ian. The connections that you made between the material and philosophical aspects of your work and the tension that you're able to describe between film and painting and photography has just been so revealing for myself, and I trust our viewers as well. We're going to now move to the Q&A part of this Tuesday night talk. And for the first question, Ian, we'll keep it pretty general. When did modernism begin and end?
Oh my goodness. That's you want an hour lecture? No. Modernism and you know, basically it's the outcome of the development of modern art. I could go on and on about this because it's one of the major themes of my art historical research and such. But I would, when I use the term modernism in the generation of my own personal art history now, and I've been making and exhibiting art for more than 50 years. I exhibited my first work at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 1965, which is now 55 years ago. And that I would say is the real classic period of modernism, of you know, highly kind of mature age of the whole period of the development, technically and conceptually, of modern art in general that started in the early 20th century.
Thank you. That very comprehensive answer.
Yeah, if you want to say
a question that is quite timely.
Modernism.
So has COVID-19 put the nail in the coffin of postmodernism? Will this pandemic birth a new art movement?
Well, postmodernism is the term that I was using quite early. It actually first arose in my experience in architecture discussions back in the early 70s. That when I started using photography, which I dropped my development of monochrome painting in 1968 was when I did my last monochrome painting of that period, and started experimenting with a more open what I call an arte povera style, which was au courant at the time in the late 1960s, turning to use of photography. Now, photography brought in, naturally, according to the medium, questions of representation and interpretation, more literary content, you might say, narrative and dramatic and cinematic content and popular cultural content into the work. Now, this was applied to the term or understood as part of the program of postmodernism. In other words, a movement away from endgame abstraction. Now, I still see that abstract art as a valid and continuing form of expression, and abstract painting. For years, I was identified as a person that was trying to kill off painting, but it was never true, and not true, certainly, because I still even call my works paintings to the present day, even though they incorporate photography. So I use a hybrid technique on that. Now, postmodernism in some ways continues under those terms, but by combining, you might say, modernist compositional and abstract elements plus postmodern representational elements, especially in the photographic elements. I don't have a term for this, but I think of it as more like a relational art or a hybrid development of the unity of, or a certain development of late modernism passing over to media-oriented and technical developments of more contemporary experimental and representational art that deals with subject matter. Now that's where the development of subject matter in my themes, masculine, feminine, becomes very important to my work.
Okay, and we've got 2 more questions before we go, and we will be posting, we've received a wealth of questions this evening, and we'll post them online over the next few days, and we'll talk with Ian about answering those. But moving on, can you talk about Anything Company and its connection to your current practice?
Oh, and Ian Baxter and Ingrid Baxter of Anything Company. Well, Ian, when I first was a student at UBC, Ian Baxter, I think he came on faculty. I started at UBC in night school courses in 1963, but Ian Baxter came on in 1965, and I got to know him immediately. I took courses from him, learned a lot from him, and was, of course, he was very, very ahead of the game on using photography and all kinds of experimental techniques and approaches to what became called later in the 60s conceptual art. And so Anything Company was a tremendous influence upon my work and everybody in this region. I was very disappointed when he moved away to Toronto and ceased to have a direct presence in Vancouver. But he is still a very active artist and an excellent artist. Not him, just him, but Ingrid Baxter as well, of course, who's still in Vancouver. But they were a great team and a tremendous influence, and contributed a lot to the development of photoconceptualism as I see it in Vancouver. That was a very rich and productive and inspiring to many, many artists in the Vancouver region.
Thank you. That's a very fascinating piece of Canadian art history. So the final question before we close, what current project are you working on that most excites you?
Well, right now it's we're all in limbo. A number of projects that I was supposed to be working on have been postponed, of course, because there was no travel. I was supposed to be in Barcelona last week, but and I was supposed to be in Italy at the end of this month working on a project, but that's all postponed. In any case, I'm actually working on an architectural project right now in Toronto. I'm not going to give any details of that. That'll come out in good time. I'm working constantly as, well, I was an art history instructor for, well, about 30 years really. And it was my passion. And I constantly do research in art history, contemporary art history. I'm doing a lot of research on the history of British Columbia and Vancouver art with a number of people. And that's an ongoing project for me. I'm doing a lot of research in the history of Cubism. That obviously, as you see from the painting behind me, the event structure from the masculine and feminine series is very cubistic in composition. So I'm investigating that. And I'm really interested in Picasso's collages and Braque's collages of 1912, which combined appropriated imagery with abstract drawing and painting, excuse me. So yes, I'm constantly on the go, and with this interregnum in the studio, with this lockdown and self-isolation, I'm taking care of a lot of my archives. I'm now almost 77 years old. So I've only got a few more, maybe another decade of productive work. I don't know if I can keep up to Gordon Smith on that record, but I'll try. And therefore, I'm getting my archive together and just so that future researchers that want to follow up on my work, and there's quite a few, will have all of the documents to understand my work better than I ever have.
Well, Ian, I just want to say thank you. Your work, your practice, and your presence as a whole is so incredibly vigorous, and I'm inspired by your work. And thank you for bringing our viewers closer to this piece in the Audain Art Museum's collection. I think it was a wonderful context, and there's so much more to talk about this evening, but I think this is where we're going to wind up. And I just want to say what an honor it's been all week long working at this, Ian, and we're so privileged to have you here as our first of the Tuesday night talks. And I just wanted to say to all our viewers, you'll be receiving an invite in the next few days for next Tuesday. And thank you again, Ian. And I want to also express my thanks to our producer and director off camera, Justine Nickel, and our quality control person, Erica Chan. All of this is made possible through them, as well as the founders of this museum, the members, all our sponsors and supporters as a whole. We work with a wonderful team here, and it is, as I said, Ian, just a great privilege to have you in False Creek, me here in Whistler in the dark. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you. I second all that. And thank you very much for the opportunity to get even closer to my work, as awkward as it is talking to my computer. And I look forward to some
wonderful evening, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, Ian. And we're going to close out with some credits that'll tell you about the next TNT talks to come from the Audain Art Museum here in Whistler, British Columbia. Thank you, everyone.